Now we have the formulations of categorical imperative. Kant presents the single categorical imperative of morality with this statement: act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This may be difficult to understand, but we will elaborate this statement in the following details. Although there is only one categorical imperative with that line, Kant argues that there can be four formulations of this principle. So, according to Kant, each of these four formulations will produce the same conclusion regarding the morality of any particular action. So, number one, the formula of the law of nature. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. It is also called as the law of universality. Second, the formula of end itself, or respect for humanity or respect for the person. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as means, but always at the same time as an end. Then the third, the formula of autonomy. So act that your will can regard itself at the same time as making universal law through its maxims. Then fourth, the formula of the kingdom of ends. So act as if you were through your maxims a law-making member of kingdom of ends. Though we have four here, but most of the authors of the books we use, they usually focus only on the first two, the universality and the humanity as an end. So we will explain now the first and the second formulation of the same categorical imperative, though it's important to note the thing that we mentioned a while ago, that these four formulations actually mean the same, mean only one formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the previous statement that we learned. Anyhow, we will proceed by elaborating the categorical imperative with these first two formulations. Now, the first formulation of the categorical imperative is the formula of law of nature, or universalizability, the ability to be universalized. With this statement, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. The formula of universalizability, or the ability to be universalized, commands act only on maxims that you can and at the same time will to become a universal law. This is not difficult to understand. It simply means that for one's action to be morally right, one must be willing to have everyone act in the same way. What Kant wanted to emphasize is that we should only do those acts which can become universal law. That is a rule of conduct for all men under the same circumstances, and refrain from doing those acts which cannot and should not be a maxim for all or cannot be universalized. Applying this formula is uncomplicated. It does not require any computation. It simply asks a personal question, requires a sense of honesty and a bit of imagination. In the first principle rests Kant's demand that man should perform only those actions that have universal repercussions. Therefore, one should not perform acts that cannot be universalized. Kant contends that suicide, which is nothing else but if done by all, can lead to the extinction of mankind, and not paying debts are actions that cannot become universal. In the principle of universality or universalizability, Kant argues that one, before doing an act, should first of all ask if the action per se is an action which one wants others to likewise do. If not, then it is not universally acceptable. In deciding most appropriate course of action, we are advised to do two simple tests to determine the moral rightness of every alternative act. So these two questions to test if an action is universalizable, able to be universalized. So ask yourself, is this what I want others to do? Then the second is think of a hypothetical situation and imagine what happens when all people do the act all at the same time. If we immediately realize that we do not want others to do the act in the first test, or we cannot will it to be a maxim for others, then it is morally wrong and we should refrain from doing it. If we do not mind others doing it, then it is morally good and we should do it regardless of its consequence. So that is on the first test. On the second test, if we want a situation where all people are doing the act all at the same time, then we can will it and can proceed to do the act regardless of its consequences. If, on the other hand, we do not want the situation to happen, then we cannot will it. Hence, we must refrain from doing the act regardless of the consequence of not doing it. So we have the case here to elaborate more the formula of universalizability. So it comes in handy if we apply this simple test. Let us now consider the case provided, which is the case of Mr. X. Mr. X works as an auditor in a big state university. Life is hard for her, a widow for 8 years. She is a sole bread earner for her brood of 6. As state auditor, she is sometimes exposed to various opportunities for corruption, which can add a little more to her meager income. To her credit, not once did she exploit her powers and authority for her personal interests. Then the situation she fears occurs. Her youngest daughter meets an accident in school and suffers a traumatic brain injury. The doctor informs Mrs. X, is Mrs. not Mr. Mrs. X that her daughter's condition is critical and requires a major surgery. The operation is expensive, but the doctor is stressed it is the only option left if her daughter is to be saved. Mrs. X does all she can to raise the needed amount for surgery, but what she gathers is just not enough. Then one day, a university administrator sets a meeting with her and requests her for a favor. The request turns out to be anomalous. She is asked to certify to a falsehood, clearing the administrator of culpability in an anomaly. The administrator promises to pay her handsomely in addition to a lasting friendship and a sum of money far more than what she needed for her daughter's operation. With time running out of her daughter and with a rare opportunity in her hands, what would you do if you were Mrs. X? So, observe closely how the most ethical course of action is determined through the two-step process that we have just discussed. The issue in this case is whether Mrs. X ought to commit an act of dishonesty or not. Human emotions will tell us that if we were Mrs. X, there is a strong temptation to give in to the request, thinking of the financial reward that is its consequence. The financial reward can save the life of her daughter. We often hear from parents that they would do everything and anything for their children. In this case, to save the life of a daughter, regardless of whether the means is ethical or not. Is the most ethical would justify the act of dishonesty and corruption. Unfortunately, what we feel right course of action any mother can do. For some, the love of parents for their children may sometimes not necessarily be the right thing to do. Feelings or emotions are not sure guides to morality. Our emotions, passions, and sense of involvement oftentimes blur our objectivity and the soundness of our moral judgment. Mistakes are most often done at this height of human emotion, and acts are most regretted when the shadows of sadness, excitement, anger, or joy leaves men's hearts. This led Immanuel Kant to think that reason, not emotion, is the best guide of morality, and reason tells us that we must act only on maxims that we can at the same time will to become a universal law. In the case presented above of Mrs. X, if we were Mrs. X trying to figure out if it is right to commit an act of dishonesty, we need to apply the first test. We should reflect and ask ourselves the question, if others are in the same condition and situation as mine, is this what I really want others to do? The answer will immediately come to us that we cannot wield the maxim that others ought to commit dishonesty or corruption. Our sense of objectivity will tell us that corruption is not right and it is not a permissible act. The second test will further show that this act could not be made a maxim for all. Let us think a hypothetical situation where all people act dishonestly, all at the same time. Do we really want the situation to happen? Just the thought of living in a dishonest and corrupt world will make us disclaim the morality of the act. In the dishonest or corrupt hidden world, we cannot trust anyone, including the very people who are dear to us. People will no longer trust their government or any institutions. Unity and cooperation will no longer be possible. Hence, our human society would cease to be as we know it. We cannot possibly will to exist in such condition. Thus, by removing the element of emotion and temporarily removing in our minds our personal interests, it is no doubt that the alternative of acting corruptly and dishonestly must be avoided. Making decisions in situations like this, of course, is very difficult, and the right decisions are sometimes painful to take, but living the virtuous life requires moral fortitude, a strong and determined will to avoid what is wrong and to do what is right, regardless of its consequence. Now we go to the second formulation of the categorical imperative. A major moral implication of the formula of universalizability is the respect for person or respect for humanity. It is expressed as follow the formula of end itself. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So for Immanuel Kant, persons are ends in themselves. Hence, they must not be used as means for other ends. What makes Kant think that persons are ends in themselves is his belief that all human beings, regardless of their accidental characteristics, for example, race or nationality, social status, age, gender, and others, equally possess inalienable dignity and rights. Any act insofar as they degrade human dignity and rights necessarily violates this formula. As one of the foundations of Kant's categorical imperative, this formula is unconditional, that is, regardless of the goodness of purpose or of consequence, any act that treats human beings as means or as a tool or as an instrument to an end is always wrong, even if people give their consent, informed or not, voluntary or forced. Treating them as mere instruments to achieve whatever ends is still morally wrong. At this point, it should be clarified that this formula does not mean that doing something for others or asking people to help us or employing them for legitimate work is a degradation of man's humanity. Kant rebukes the deliberate attempt to make man commit an unethical act or things against his will for other ends. Slavery, prostitution, and exploitation of labor are examples of which no reason could suffice to justify their morality. These acts treat persons as means and absolutely degrade man's dignity and rights. For Kant, man, and generally rational being, exists as an end in himself or herself, not merely as means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. Kant therefore stresses that man is not a means to an end, he is an end in himself. This principle of humanity, however, is for Kant not derived from experience. It is all a priori. It calls for man's unconditional respect for his fellow men. Kant hates actions that lead to the dispersonalization, dehumanization, and the alienation of man. Like in the first categorical formula, applying this formula is not complicated. It only requires the asking of personal question and honesty in answering it. Before we do an act, we should ask ourselves, will my action treat myself or other persons as means to other ends? Or will my action degrade my dignity as a person or the dignity of others? If we honestly think that we will treat ourselves or other persons as means to an end, or degrade our dignity, or violate our rights, then the act is wrong, and we should refrain from doing it. If we think that the act will not treat us means or whatever end to whatever end, then the act is morally right and it would be fine to commit to do it. So we have now the case of a medical researcher in order to elaborate the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the value of person or of humanity. Mr. Y, as a medical researcher in the government's Food and Drugs Commission, because of his credibility and competence, he is tasked to lead a small team of researchers to study the effect on the health of popular products suspected to have caused serious health problems among many consumers. After months of study, Mr. Y confirms the suspicion. He thought that it is in the public's best interest to recommend the immediate recall and banning of the product. When Mr. Y was about to prepare the report of his study, a high-ranking government official went to see him. The official requested Mr. Y to reconsider his findings so as not to damage the image of a very benevolent corporation which manufactures the product. The official assured him that the product is safe and stressed that it must stay that way. Before the official left, he made clear that Mr. Y needs to make a new and better report, otherwise he should start looking for another job. Aware that he badly needs his job, Mr. Y faces the dilemma of whether to write a truthful report or do what the government official wanted him to do, suppress the truth. What should Mr. Y do? It is clear in this particular case that Mr. Y is deliberately forced to perform an act against his will. Pressuring Mr. Y do an unethical act, that is, to suppress the truth and make fallacious pronouncements about the product, is a degradation of his human dignity. Writing a fallacious report declaring the product as safe would also mean the unfair vindication of a company which has already caused a lot of harm to people. This shows that Mr. White treated as a means to a selfish end and not an end in himself. So, applying the second formula of the categorical imperative, act always so as to treat humanity in your own person or in that of another as an end in itself, never merely as a means. It becomes clear that writing an erroneous report is unethical. The most ethical course of action, therefore, is to write the truth about the product regardless of its consequence. As we have already noted, it is the thought of consequence of our action that forces us to opt for an unethical course of action. And in this case, it is the fear of losing one's job that will most likely distort our perception of what is good and what we ought to do. Ignoring the consequence of our act, therefore, would make us more objective in making decisions and in choosing the most ethically appropriate course of action.